We'll just wait until people join. We'll wait for people to join, but we will continue for the sake of time. Happy Wednesday, everyone. My name is Dr. Patty Montojo. I'm a licensed psychologist and also manager of our academic and staff assistance program. And I have here with me my colleague.
Hi, I'm Dr. Melissa Cordero. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist here at ASAP. So welcome and thank you so much for being here today.
And today we're going to talk about the psychological impact of race-based stress among communities of color. So if we can go to the next slide. As you may know, it might be an uncomfortable topic for some. And so I just hope that in addition to the roles of engagement on Zoom, that we also keep it real and know that bias is hard to talk about, but it's important and essential that we do so openly and honestly. For this reason, I imagine that some people decided not to join. So I commend you for being here. Keeping it curious, come in open to learning something new, possibly, and stay curious about discomfort. It is a way to learn and grow. And keeping it balanced. The goal is for our community, our campus community, to work together to address challenges and opportunities, and we want to hear from everyone. So if you want to, we will save hopefully 8 to 10 minutes at the end for any questions. I would love a discussion. You have the chat feature, the Q&A feature, and if that is still not a comfortable method of communication, then you can please feel free to email us individually. So next slide. I like to start here. If you look at our ASAP team and compare it to 2 years ago, 20 years ago, you'd find a very, very different mental health team. For the first time since April 2020, we have an all-female team, a team of 3 Latinas, and for the first time in ASAP history, the entire team can provide services, psychological services, consultation services in Spanish. This is the first of many. I've had to break many barriers to achieve this goal, but my mission has been to have a diverse clinical team that represents and values diversity, and I'm very, very grateful for both Melissa and Veronica. Veronica is our part-time doctoral practicum clinician. So we always have every year a new doctoral practicum clinician, and that is somebody who is in the doctoral program on campus at CCSP, learning how to be a psychologist one day. And so she's completing her clinical training, and actually today or tomorrow, she will have completed her 2nd year with ASAP. So I'm very, very grateful for the work that she's done. And so she's on here helping us manage all multitask by sharing her screen. In addition to that, I'd like to note that there are only about 5,000 psychologists in the US who identify as Latinx. That's only 5% of all psychologists. Yet the Latinx population is growing at a very quick rate. And so I'm very grateful for the work that we can provide here on campus. Also knowing that psychologists have been involved in some of the changes over the past year, such as recognizing our own racial history in psychology, highlighting the urgent need for an anti-racism in psychology, and taking a closer look at how racism affects the profession. So there's a very, very long way to go. But I just hope that this presentation gives you the courage to address your own biases, both consciously and unconsciously, and give you the strength to work towards change. Next slide. As you know, this is very brief. I'm just putting it up here to show that our team provides individual, no-cost, confidential, short-term therapy services. Consultation for supervisors. We had a lot of this during our shutdown and due to COVID. Employees of concern, perhaps some department issues. So we worked a lot with supervisors and deans and chairs, and also just providing additional programming. So our Thriving Wellness Program, which I'm sure you're sick of seeing our name in the D list, and additional behavioral health services. So we partner with UCPD and provide a workplace violence prevention program on campus. Next slide. Question for you all, and you're welcome to put this in the chat or in the Q&A. Do kids even notice race? And I start with children because children are our next generation. They're our next leaders, our next change makers, and children is a personal interest of mine. So I have two racially and ethnically diverse toddlers, and I'm married to a mixed race man who, and I like to disclose this, and I'm starting to become more comfortable because I think this is part of showing humility and showing that we can have difficult conversations. I'm married to a mixed race man who immigrated to this country as a child from the Philippines, and also has a career in law enforcement as a police sergeant. That creates enough complexity. And in our household, we have very difficult conversations with our children about race, about social factors. And I'm talking about, I have a 3-year-old and a 2-year-old, and my husband and I may not agree on all matters, but we value each other's perspective. And I'm hoping that this presentation will give you some tools to initiate difficult discussions with respect, humility, and a sense of openness. And so I kind of, before I get there, I asked Melissa, and I overlooked this. I'm wondering, Melissa, if you can share an important part of your identity that brings this work, makes it more meaningful or personal to you.
Yes, definitely. So I identify as Latina, daughter of immigrants. My parents came from Colombia and Uruguay. And also one thing that I really like to mention also is that even though I'm Latina, we are very diverse as Latinas, and I am very light-skinned Latina, and that has an impact on my experience in this world, and something that I like to bring attention to. And my passion for doing this work is about a lot of the anti-Blackness and a lot of racism that happens within our Latin culture. So I just like to disclose and share a little bit about that, about where this interest really gets sparked, and also recognizing where my own role is in this and how that might be tainted given my own experience of being a lighter skinned Latina. So thank you.
Thank you. And back to the question, do the kids even notice race? And the answer is yes. They see and notice racial differences from a very young age, even in infancy. Several studies by psychologists have found that infants and very young children from 6 to 18 months will gaze at the faces of people of a different race longer than they look at faces from their own racial group. A prolonged gaze is how infants and toddlers commonly react to new information, and here it suggests racial difference is visually salient to them. This means that kids are able to notice and pay attention to racial differences even before they can speak about them. This does not mean that kids this young understand race in the same way adults do, nor does it mean that they are racist. But now comes the tricky part to all of you, and I get parents on campus asking me this. How do you talk to your children about race? How do you answer those difficult questions? In fact, many parents have opted not to answer them. These parents have often, with good intentions, embraced the idea of colorblindness. They assume that if they raise their children not to recognize racial differences, they'll prevent them from becoming racist. We go to the next slide. However, research suggests that parents should be more proactive, that parents can tell their kids it's okay to recognize and talk about racial differences while still communicating that it's wrong to hold racial prejudices. Dr. Allison Briscoe Smith, who I had the pleasure of meeting with while I was at UCSF, she's an assistant professor and director of diversity, equity, and inclusion at the Wright Institute in the Bay Area, found that in her research with 67 racially and ethnically diverse families, all of which had children under the age of 7, indicated that talking and answering kids' questions about race may help them understand racial issues and become more tolerant. She found that the children of parents who talked more about race were better able to identify racism when they saw it, and were also more likely to have positive views about ethnic minorities. This was true for both the white families and the families of color in her study. While there's strong evidence suggesting that parents should talk about race, researchers still don't know, how do we do this? What do we say? There is some evidence suggesting that we should avoid from using fear-based language with children. And a common suggestion that's been found when talking to your child is saying something like this, explaining to your child, people may be mean to you and treat you unfairly because you are X race, but that does not mean that you should be mean to others. Those people don't really know how great you are and how special it is to be X race. And if that happens, you can come to me and I will help you. That is one suggestion. We're getting to a place where we're trying to find the tools to talk to our children, our very young children. And if we go to the next slide, I have a very, very short video. It's less than 2 minutes. It's Dr. Anderson, who's an assistant professor at University of Michigan, and she talks about 3 tips to talking to your kids about race.
When you're saying you're afraid to talk to your child about race, it's not for them. It's because we are afraid. If we're being honest, we don't know how to talk about it and we're concerned. So what we encourage is to think about your competency rather than your content. So if you can think about what are some of the skills that I might want to develop with my child, which again might be inquiry, it's just a question. What did you notice? How did that make you feel? So if we can create skills based on inquiry, confidence because you practiced it more, maybe that means you practice with yourself in the mirror like you do when you go to your job interview or anything else. Maybe you practice it with your loved one. And again, you're unpacking for yourself first. So skills, confidence, and then stress. If you go into it without having spoken about it, without thinking about what it means for yourself, you're going to be highly stressed the entire time that you talk to your child. But if you can focus on what are the things that are within my control when I talk to my child, maybe I can't change the entire police system, but I can help my child to navigate that one specific thing that they have going on. What can I do today? So that'll reduce stress in that moment with, again, along with practice and with questions. So along the developmental age, you can use those same 3 strategies, skills, confidence, and stress. At 3, at 10, at 15, your child is never too young to have any discussion about it, but you don't want them to have the most stressful and the most strenuous conversations. But again, you're the expert, you're the parent, you already know what that is. It's time for you to take your fear away from your child being the best that they can be.
She does such a lovely job. And if you aren't subscribing to the Greater Good Science, partner with UC Berkeley, they're a great resource. If we go to the next slide, now we transition to what is race-based stress. And this refers, according to Helms and colleagues, to the mental and emotional injury caused by encounters with racial bias and ethnic discrimination, racism, and hate crimes. And now I'm going to hand it over to Melissa to highlight potentially some race-based experiences in higher education.
The next slide. Okay, so now we're going to pause for a moment to take a quiz. This is just to assess our own understanding of how race or ethnic backgrounds may impact our overall well-being as an employee. So you can feel free to put your answer in the Q&A. So the first question is, what percentage of Black identified women report being stressed out about bias in the university setting? 29%, 38%, 49%, or 60%. Give you all just a few moments, start pinning that in the chat or the Q&A. Okay. D, I'm seeing a lot of D. Okay, we'll go on to the next slide. So yes, the answer is D, 60%. We can also see from this chart just how other races and the intersectionality of gender impacts people's worry around bias. Okay, next slide. So what is the percentage of Native American identified faculty in a university setting that believe they need to work harder in order to be perceived as legitimate when compared to their white colleagues? 52.5%, 81.2%, 97.7%, or 60.3%. Feel free to put your answer in the chat. Okay, seeing a lot of C. Okay, we'll go ahead and move on to the next slide. So yes, the answer is actually 97.7% of Native American identified faculty. And here from this chart, we can also see the impact experienced by other ethnic backgrounds when compared to their white colleagues. Okay, and last question. Fear of a family member or close friend being deported is common among the Latinx community, with blank percent experiencing worries related to immigration. 68%, 50%, 42%, or 34%. Feel free to put that in your answers in the chat. So getting a lot of A, 68%. Okay, we'll move on to the next slide. So yes, 68%. So the goal of this quiz was to have a better idea of what our colleagues may be experiencing, or if we identify as a person of color or part of the Latinx community, we may just feel validated for some of our own experiences.
And now we transition to the psychological effects of racial-based stress. So experiences of race-based discrimination can have detrimental psychological impacts on individuals and their communities. Over 60% of Black Americans endorse at least one experience of racial discrimination in their lifetime. And findings suggest that the links between experiences of racial discrimination and negative health outcomes are stronger for Black Americans than for any other group. Carter 2007 states that some Black Americans who experience racial discrimination can develop racial trauma, a psychological trauma with symptoms comparable to PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, which include negative alterations to thoughts, mood, intrusive symptoms, avoidance, and physical reactions. So this can get to the point where you can mimic a stress disorder. Next slide. What can we do? What can you all do if you are supporting those who've experienced race-based stress? Well, Dr. Kira Wesley is a clinical psychologist, and she outlined these tools for addressing race-based stress. Validate. Explicitly label social factors, including barriers, limitations. Normalize impact of societal factors and provide psychoeducation to those who are uninformed. And sometimes when we're uninformed, we either provide inaccurate information or make our own erroneous assumptions. Identify strengths in the person and connect people to healthy community models and social support. Next slide. She also provides some coping skills. So if any of you or people that you know have experienced race-based stress, how do you cope with that? You first want to acknowledge racism and recognize the impact. Validate the experiences and normalize perhaps emotions that you're feeling: anger, worry, sadness, grief. Label it as it is. So I have many clients on campus who are saying, I just experienced a microaggression in the workplace. Can we talk about this? And I say, of course. Recognize the impact of racial trauma on mental health and identify any thoughts and emotions or behaviors as they relate to the experience of racism. Next slide. Additionally, you want to identify strengths and create a plan for healthy coping. So asking yourself or asking others, what has helped you cope with racism in the past? What skills can you utilize now? An important one that I think during the rise in injustices that came to the forefront, and knowing that there are so many videos out there, is limiting social media exposure, perhaps. We all have limits, and we all can approach emotional exhaustion. Engage in self-care activities, engage in activism, connecting with communities of color. I know that after the murder of George Floyd, groups on campus among faculty and staff were very shook. They they were struggling. And so we held a communities of color support group. And I don't know about Melissa, but it was as healing for them as it was for me. Just connecting with others and having that safe space to process. Or connecting with your faith, spirituality. Developing a racism recovery plan, which is a great tool created by Boston College, and I will go over it in a couple slides. Next slide. What should you not do or stay away from? Let's not over-pathologize. Let's understand and recognize healthy cultural suspicion and do not assume that someone is being quote unquote paranoid. Let's stop running from discussions of race. Let's ask questions. Let's avoid making assumptions. Practice and role play with colleagues. You want to demonstrate curiosity, humility, and sensitivity. And I know that you're all doing this by being here. So thank you. Next slide. Let's not have a dismissive approach. Do not question people's experiences of racism. So, for example, someone may experience a microaggression and then their colleague or their loved one may say, well, maybe that person didn't really mean it that way. That's not what we want to do. We want to validate. Let's stop believing that we need expertise to talk about race-based stress or trauma. Engage in these conversations. Consider how you can talk to your individual, consider how you can tailor your own strengths, how you can seek consultation from peers or colleagues who have more knowledge, and attend diversity trainings is a big one. Next slide. You want to avoid from it's really important to consider everyone's intersecting identities. And that was really important for me to disclose that in the beginning and to also have Melissa talk about that, because I want to model that. It's sometimes in the workplace, it can be uncomfortable. And you want to consider how race interacts with other aspects of our experiences. For instance, socioeconomic status, gender identity, sexual orientation. You want to stay away, hopefully, from believing that talking about race is too political. Reframe it as a human rights issue. Reflect on your own discomfort, just as a psychologist mentioned when we talk to our children about race, and create safe spaces to have these conversations in the workplace. Next slide. This is an exceptional tool, and I know that we are at the 24-minute mark and I have to pass it to Melissa soon, but this is created by Jernigan and colleagues in 2015, Boston College, and it's a wonderful tool that I think that we can integrate in the workplace or in our personal lives. They have many steps in dealing with race-based stress, and I'll just go over a couple of them, and I will, of course, make the PowerPoint available to anyone who's interested. The first step is the Racial Wellness Toolbox, and that means describe what you feel like when you're managing and responding to racism in a healthy manner. How do you feel emotionally? How do you feel physically? I had a colleague of mine, actually, a fellow psychologist who's a person of color, go to a store a couple months ago during the pandemic and was very brave and disclosed to me that whenever going to this particular store, regardless of her education, no one would know that, but she never gets service. People don't ask her, can I help you with something? And so it's kind of talking to people, knowing what do you feel like and how are you responding? How does your body react to that? The second step is the daily maintenance of centeredness in the face of racism. Describe some ways you can stay grounded, healthy, and how you care for yourself when encountering racism. Do you connect with friends who are equally or better able to engage in conversations about racial awareness? Do you engage in spiritual practices, meditation, prayer, use of mantras? Do you engage in activism? Do you practice self-management, such as healthy eating, exercise, journaling, favorite activities that help you feel centered and grounded? And I won't go through all the steps, but it's the feeling of what are your symptoms? How do you create a strategy to cope? And what activities or people make you feel centered in the face of racism? So again, I will make this available to you, but now I will hand it over to Melissa.
So we're going to go ahead and begin talking about how we can better understand and manage stress in a diverse workplace and how to enter this with complete humility. Next slide, please. So there's a term called diversity tension, which is the stress and the strain that accompanies mixtures of differences and similarities. And what the research shows is that by embracing this diversity tension, we can actually create change that leads to quality decisions in the midst of having differences within our identities, as well as having similarities and other pressures that we might be experiencing. So leaders who prepare and empower their employees to understand others without judging and to be comfortable with diversity tension are actually more productive and successful. So this next slide, I'm going to be talking about ways on how we can do that and how we can implement it into the workplace. So the first point is to just create an inclusive work environment where a diverse group of employees can feel welcomed and valued for sharing their opinions and skills, even if they're different than the status quo. To recognize and reward successes that result from valuing diversity. So really, as a manager or a director, recognizing when your employees are making these changes and how can we really encourage more of this. Also assessing the different learning styles of our employees, learning also our different strengths so that we can really use diversity to really help grow and expand our programming. And in order to do that, we need to involve people from a variety of backgrounds when we're making big decisions and when we're problem solving. And another way we can do this is collaboratively identify ways that people can feel valued for their diversity. And you can do this through surveys and exploring ideas that people have and really finding ways to implement it. That is the key. I know we can offer all of these surveys, but how do we actually begin to apply it to our work setting and start creating activities that really value diversity and make change according to some of this feedback that we might get? Next slide. So this next part of the presentation, I'm going to be talking about the role of tough compassion and how we can support our diverse staff and faculty. If any of you have been to my previous presentations, you all know that compassion is something I'm always talking about. It's something that I strongly value and feel like it has many roles. And even when it comes to racism, is how can we have tough compassion? So I'll talk a little bit more about that in these next slides. So tough compassion means speaking up, setting boundaries, and making uncomfortable choices for the greater good. So it's not about just accepting everyone and being passive and saying that everything is okay. Sometimes it's really difficult and we do have to make uncomfortable choices. Tough compassion includes expressing that you value someone as a human being, even though you might disagree openly with how they're behaving or what they're saying. So in the Buddhist contemplative tradition, the purpose of practicing true compassion is to find ways to decrease suffering for everyone. So we want to really recognize that is the goal of compassion. It's not just to reduce suffering for one person and not make one person uncomfortable, so I'm not going to say something to that person. It's really recognizing that it's for the larger good. Next slide, please. So the Dalai Lama calls tough compassion like tough love. So practicing tough compassion can come out in different ways, like through storytelling. So research actually shows that a story-based approach can create significant change in the way people see the world. With storytelling, you can take a tough stance and show the other person the results of their actions without launching a direct attack. And when you do this, you're really communicating. You're communicating in a way that's enveloped in compassion, your fundamental boundaries, what you can and cannot accept, and inviting the other person into that conversation. Next slide, please. So let's talk about how can we have these difficult conversations using tough compassion. So we want to begin by taking down notes of what kind of story you would like to tell. And the goal is to make each point based on the intent to take the argument into another direction and create a space for dialogue. So I have an example of a story here. My cousin, friend, neighbor, you can fill in the blank, hears insults like that all the time. She also has been attacked in public. And because of that, it's hard for her to trust that people are going to respect her as a human being. So the goal of telling a story like this is to elicit a compassionate response from the other person. It's helping them to realize how their comment can cause this person suffering and hopefully begin to shift this. Next, please. So I really want to talk about this because I feel like a lot of times people are steering away from having these conversations or joining these webinars because they're afraid of being shamed. And so, you know, a lot of research says that shaming someone causes people to withdraw from the situation. And so we want to drop that approach of shaming others because it just blocks people and then we're stuck. So we're going to be talking about other ways to address that, also address when our own defenses come up. And one thing is to stay internally grounded. And this is for the person maybe having the difficult conversation, also the person receiving the information. How can we stay grounded so we can really listen? And so I'm going to be talking about ways that we can do that in this next session. But this next part, just briefly before we transition, is also how do we begin to just drop results? So we can drop attachment to the results that we have. Ultimately, that person decides if they're going to shift. So we want to just know our role in being able to have these conversations, play the role of tough compassion, but at the end of the day, that person decides to change or not. All right, so sorry, we'll go into the next section now. So this next section is actually using the body's wisdom to heal, and we're going to be taking a journey inward to really explore what this is like. This is a very different approach that is less common. I know we've been having lots of dialogues, so this is just a different way that we can maybe work with some of our defenses and also heal ourselves when we experience a microaggression. So Peter Levine says that trauma is perhaps the most avoided, ignored, belittled, denied, misunderstood, and untreated cause of human suffering. So advances in psychobiology show that emotions activate this complex system of nerves called the vagus nerve. Not that you have to remember any of this, but just to get a better idea of how our body is actually engaged in all of this. And that this vagus nerve connects the brainstem, the pharynx, the heart, lungs, stomach, gut, and spine. And so we hold these emotions in our bodies. Oftentimes we're not noticing what the sensations are in our body. We're not taught to check in with our bodies and notice what our bodies are feeling. And so oftentimes we just move through our day with no awareness that our body's actually remembering and reacting to various unconscious past and present experiences. So unconscious associations and bias play a role in how our bodies perceive and process threat. Research on bias shows that when participants were asked to think about a crime and shown both a white face and a black face, people looked significantly more at the black face than the white face. And this is because of the way that we are socialized through media, the messages that we got from our families, our peers, different movies that we watch. These are all instilled and they're unconscious. We can have a trauma response to anything that we perceive as a threat. This can include physical safety and also to what someone does, says, thinks, or even cares about or yearns for. Bias and racism, as well as the personal impact of these, don't only live in our thinking brains, but also our bodies. So yes, we can have all these discussions, and this is helpful. We need to become more aware of our unconscious biases, but we also have to look into our bodies. Through this research, we can see that we may hold this unconscious bias, and we can begin to actually work through this by becoming more aware and beginning to shift these associations that have been imprinted not only in our thinking brain, but also in our bodies. So I'll talk a little bit more about this. I know this might seem a little bit esoteric or a little bit out there. So I'll talk a little bit more to hopefully help you bring more of a personalization of how you can actually apply this. So our brains are thankfully very malleable, Brains respond to our environment and adjust according to challenges. And we can change the wiring of our brain. By bringing awareness to our body and allowing ourselves to be the witness of these physiological experiences, we begin to process, heal, and release associations that no longer serve us. This process is also helpful if you've been on the receiving end of racism. We can begin to heal this on a cellular level. So we're going to be talking about that a little bit more on this next slide. So Manikim speaks of the importance of seeing racism as a collective issue that we all need to take a part in healing. Trauma has been passed down to us in different ways. It can be through our own experiences and those also of our ancestry. We may be conscious or unconscious of this, and therefore the goal is to use the body as a way to heal and transform. Research in human genetics actually suggests that trauma is passed down through our DNA, and that our bodies hold on to this unprocessed trauma of our ancestors. So we're going to talk a little bit more on this next slide about intergenerational trauma. So this can get passed down through our families, in which families abuse each other. This can be passed down through unsafe or abusive systems, structures, institutions, and cultural norms, and through our genes. So I'm going to talk about more in this next slide about how we can begin to actually process this pain. If we are unconscious and unaware of our own, not only our own experience of it, but our own role in it, we can't heal. So the first thing is to become aware of this. And oftentimes our defenses come up. It's a natural thing. And so we have to just know that that's going to come up. So if you're someone that's been in a situation where maybe you identify as white and you've been called out for committing a microaggression, maybe you said to yourself, I'm not like that. I'm a good person. And yes, maybe you are a very good person. And also there's this piece that is just unconscious and we need to heal on a deeper cellular level, which is why I talked a little bit more about intergenerational trauma. So in this moment, if you've experienced that, either on the receiving end or been told that you have committed a microaggression, let's take a moment and go back to that and notice, where in your body are you feeling this? Is there constriction? Is there other sensations that you're experiencing as you go back to that moment of being accused of committing a microaggression or being at that moment where you experienced that microaggression? We can actually begin to heal this on both angles. So this next slide breaks it down a little bit more simple. So this gives you just a little bit of a guidance of how do we do this. So we can use this and apply this all the time. We can use this and apply this right now as you're sitting and listening to this webinar. So the first thing we want to do before we go into some of the more challenging sensations in our body, we have to come from a place of being grounded. So the way we do this is we orient ourselves to the space that we're in by just looking around your room and looking for something that just helps you feel safe, something that helps you feel calm. And take a moment, and as you look at this object, and I invite you all to do it right here, right now, notice what shifted in your body. How do you know that this object or this picture or whatever it is that you're looking at is something safe to look at? What were the cues in your body that let you know of this? And take a moment and notice it. What is that sensation like? Where do you feel that in your body? Is there an image tied to that? Does it feel open? Does it feel closed? So just become aware of the quality of this. And I recognize I'm teaching you a completely different language right now. This is not the way we normally relate to ourselves or ask ourselves these questions. So if this feels uncomfortable or you're not sure if you're doing it right, that's okay. This is very different. So just take a moment and be curious about what you're feeling. And now go back to one of these situations, either where you experience a microaggression or where you maybe committed one or you got defensive around a situation or a topic. And become curious about that sensation that you're feeling in your body. Become the observer of what is happening in your body without needing to change it, just being present with it. And the more curious we become, the more it starts to loosen, because we can't be anxious, defensive, and curious at the same time. As soon as we become curious, things begin to shift. And so begin to take a moment to see what happens as you become curious. Track it. Is it becoming constricted? Is it becoming more open? Is it feeling lighter? Is there movement happening? So there's many different associations that we won't go into a lot of detail today, but that are related to these experiences. And that's why I ask about images, sounds, all those things, because our brain experiences a gestalt of the memory of that experience that doesn't just involve the words of what we felt, but the emotions, the sensations, maybe images. So we want to begin to become aware of the whole picture so that we can begin to untangle it a little bit, loosen it a little bit. But the only way we can do that is by being present. And now we're going to take a moment to just reorient and ground ourselves. So we go into something that might be uncomfortable briefly, and then we balance it by reorienting and grounding. So it's a little less scary to go into what may have been a traumatic experience. So we'll take a moment and find that object once again, whatever it was that helped you feel calm and safe. Notice what you're feeling in your body as you reconnect with this object. Notice if things are beginning to open up or if your body's beginning to release. And we're going to just take a pause there, and we'll go to the next slide as you begin just to kind of recenter yourself. And I recognize that this topic is very big and that somatics is not something you're going to learn in just a brief webinar, but I invite you, if this was something that you were drawn to learn more about, I invite you to explore this on your own. I have hyperlinks to various different resources, books, podcasts, interviews on healing trauma in the body, articles on collective healing, and also a link to somatically trained therapists that might be able to help you heal from both racist experiences, what has been passed down through our ancestors, and also our own role if we have committed microaggressions or if we are part of this in some way. How can we heal those messages that have been passed down through our ancestors? So it is big work. So definitely this is just an introduction, but I invite you to explore these things on your own if you're interested. So I'm going to pause there for questions. And I know Veronica is going to kind of help us with that, because I know that there was probably lots of questions through the Q&A or the chat.
So now we open it up. Questions, comments? Veronica, are there any outstanding questions?
There aren't any. The one that came in is if the resources will be shared.
Yes, we will be sharing all resources. And those are all hyperlinks, so you can also click on those to get more information.
Yeah, the PowerPoint will be shared, and then we'll also send a quick, short ASAP survey to kind of assess satisfaction and assess kind of efficacy of the presentation. But now I open it. We have 5 minutes. Any questions or comments from the audience?
And I see someone just mentioning that it's a nice reminder about being able to talk openly with our kids about that this is an ongoing process. So thank you for that comment. And it is. It's not something we're going to figure out and fix in one day. It's something, many conversations.
Yeah. And it takes a lot of courage, right? I think it takes courage and awareness as parents for us to initiate the conversation, similar to what the psychologists were saying, and be comfortable with it. So I have, my 3-year-old is asking about, his dad as a police sergeant, and yet he's asking about the police who do bad things. And we're having really difficult conversations, and never did I anticipate this to happen at such a young age. But it's at the forefront, and they ask questions, and we don't want to dismiss those curious minds.
Patty, can you share how the slides will be shared and how they'll be able to access them?
Yeah, so usually what happens is Judy, our lovely administrative assistant who supports us in so many ways, she will email that to all of the participants who attended. The presentation will also be recorded. It's actually recorded now, and it will be uploaded to our YouTube channel as well. So both will be available, but in the past, Judy has emailed to the attendees.
And there are two more questions that came in. So the first one is, do you have any suggestions for how this topic might be addressed in the classroom, perhaps even at the beginning of a course, even if it isn't directly about this topic?
What I've had is some faculty acknowledge the topic in their syllabus or in their syllabi. And so it kind of sets the foundation. And this is taken from faculty who have really heard and listened to students. I know that there was a big move with students on campus wanting there to be a shift. And so that's one way that I've heard of just making sure that it's part of their curriculum, it's part of their teaching methodology or pedagogy. And so I don't know if, Veronica, you have any more personal experiences as a graduate student, or Melissa, if you know of any other ways.
Yeah, I think that as a graduate student, looping back to what you shared at the beginning of talking about intersectionality and power dynamics, and naming them, right? Naming that they exist at all levels of the institution, at the classroom setting, at the staff setting, and really engaging in those difficult conversations so that it doesn't go unsaid or unnamed. There are a couple questions that came up, Patty and Liz, and I'll read them out loud and then we can gauge on our time. So the last two that came up were, a lot of these tips are useful at the individual level. How do we make changes structurally in the workplace? Often white faculty and administrators are looking for BIPOC students, staff, or for advice on anti-racism. How do we manage up in these situations? And then the other question that came up was, are there any suggestions on how to avoid news cycle fatigue and how to be proactive in this angle? I have been guilty of shutting off news because it's exhausting.
Yeah. I think with the fatigue, we have to remind ourselves that this last year was horrific in many ways. And many people, I mean, we're still in a pandemic and we're still in very different hard circumstances. And so I think it's finding the balance and knowing what is good for you. Like my baseline could be very different from your baseline. And when do you know, what are some behaviors or thoughts that you know are tipping over the edge? So is it more of irritability or frustration? Are you having these thoughts of, oh, here we go again, or there's no hope in this country? And so it's finding that balance so that you're not tipping over and you still maintain hope and still want to do some kind of work if you're still interested in change. So that's my immediate reaction or response to that question. Yeah. And the other one, Melissa.
Yes. So the other question that was asked, definitely we have to make larger changes on an institutional level. And I feel like this is by involving a diverse group of people to make decisions about change. Really having a diverse staff and faculty begins to elicit that. So we get ideas from various people rather than this top-down approach. We're experiencing bringing many different people into this decision-making process and valuing those opinions, and really integrating what we learn from surveys. I know there's been a lot of surveys that have been going out and a lot of time's been spent on that. And like, how do we begin to actually integrate some of these suggestions rather than just getting the information? We need to do more than that. So I know it is a larger goal, but it's definitely necessary.
Yeah, and I don't think there are, I mean, to change structures and systems is I imagine it's a long process. And a lot of us kind of work towards what can individuals do because it seems more feasible. Seems like we can make some movement and change. And even though that systems need a change, I do think that and it's going to be a hard and long process. But
I'm wondering if there's time for one more question, Patty and Melissa.
sure.
So the last question we have for today is if you have any thoughts on how to repair or how to begin the process of repairing a relationship with someone has committed a microaggression, and how do you bring attention to it, particularly in the supervisor-supervisee dynamic, and oftentimes the difficulties of asking someone to be accountable or letting them know that they just engaged in a microaggression.
So I would want to incorporate a little bit of that tough compassion that I was speaking about earlier. And can we use storytelling in a way that the person may be a little less defensive and more open and more compassionate to see what the impact of their microaggression had on this other individual? And I think once we're able to help them have compassion for that, hopefully, naturally, they're going to want to repair that either through, having that conversation and apologize and recognizing their humanness and their imperfection and what are they going to do as a way to be more committed to shift that, I think is a start.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely talking from your own perspective, using the I language, the I statements, because no one can take that experience away from you. Like that is something that caused injury on many levels. And I've seen that for some supervisory relationships or for some people in general, they do want to do better. They feel horrible for perhaps unconsciously or implicitly committing an error. And other people become too defensive that it creates a barrier. And that's when I see it. I see the repair not working so well or not being so common in those situations. Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. It takes courage and it takes bravery. And this is a topic that is personally and professionally close to our hearts. And I'd have to admit that we were both really nervous and excited and invigorated, but because this topic is so heavy and so complex. So I just want to say thank you for taking the time. I know that we're all really busy, but we need more of this. And then I just want to say thank you and have a wonderful week.
Yeah. Thank you so much for being here. Take care.